morning, everybody, and welcome to our Express Entry Roadmap webinar. I'm Maya Krishnaratne. I'm a lawyer here at Devery Smith Frank, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome and thank you all for being here today, joining us so early, and also those of you who are joining us from different time zones across the world. It's really great in a time of unprecedented and unique social distancing that we can still get together in this way and share information, specifically on a topic of global nature, and in a way that anticipates a future where global migration and international travel will one day be normal and back on the radar. So today's seminar will focus on Canada's Express Entry system. For those of you who have already done some research into this or may have applications underway, you'll be well aware that the Express Entry system is not a category of immigration itself, but rather is a method for handling applications relating to three particular economic routes to permanent residence. Sorry, bearing with technical issues, which is another thing that we're all trying to learn and having to do these remote sessions. So bear with me throughout if there are any technical issues. The purpose of today's seminar in talking about Express Entry is to give you an overview of really what Express Entry is, and to try to equip you with information that will help you navigate the three categories of permanent resident applications that fall within the Express Entry system. That really is going to entail mostly a broad overview of the categories and the minimum requirements to meet in order to be considered under those categories, as well as the Express Entry system and how it works and what you can expect with any applications you currently have underway or that you expect to get underway shortly. This seminar, which is supposed to be around 45 minutes to an hour, can't cover every possible problem or concern that might arise in one of these three categories. And just to state what those are, it's the Federal Skilled Worker, the Canadian Experience class, and the Federal Skilled Trades class. The seminar can't cover all the ins and outs of all of them. Really, you could take a day to go through issues pertaining to each. But again, today I hope to give you a broad overview of the categories and what you can expect in an application. To give you some idea of the firm, Devery Smith Frank, we're a full-service law firm based here in Toronto, Ontario. We've got offices in Whitby and Barrie, Ontario as well. And the firm, being 60 lawyers and up, we service a very wide range of clientele and a very wide range of practice areas. I'm a partner here in the insurance and immigration law groups, but of course, today's focus will be on immigration. In terms of our clients, though we're based here in Toronto, we serve clients all over the country, and particularly with our immigration group, we're proud to serve clients across the whole world. Today I'm not going to be doing a formal Q&A. What I will do is offer you my direct email address and direct phone number and encourage you to email me if you've got questions. I find that with the Express Entry system, questions are often very specific and require more than just a quick question and an answer. So I would ask you to please send me an email. I will endeavor to collate everything, particularly the information that would be useful to everybody, and then send that out to all of you who have registered. And I'll put this information back up at the end. So to get right into it, no doubt most of you who are tuning in are either already in Canada or have done your research. You may be here on study permits or work permits or under some other basis, and so you're probably pretty familiar with Canada from a geographic perspective. So I'm not giving you a lesson on that, but I put the map up just to contextualize what we're talking about Canada being broken up into 10 provinces and 3 territories, it's useful information for you to know that each of those territories and provinces functions at the level of a provincial government, meaning they've got their own individual governments which deal with and regulate certain areas of law and society, such as healthcare and insurance, whereas the Canadian federal government governs the whole country of Canada, all the provinces and territories, and particularly handles and implements and is presiding over certain areas of law, such as tax, criminal, and in particular immigration. And I point that out only because those of you who have been doing some research likely know that we have several provincial-based immigration programs, programs specific to the province's needs. And while those are handled and designed and dealt with by the provinces and territories themselves, that ultimate decision on whether or not an immigration application is granted still comes from the federal government level. I won't go through all of these stats, but I've just highlighted some of the most prominent cities in Canada. Not that this is something that has to be decided at early stages, but eventually throughout the process of your express entry profile and application, you do ultimately end up making some indication of where it is you plan to settle. And so I encourage people to do research. I've highlighted the 3 what I consider to be most multicultural, diverse economic type hubs across the country, but really you should do some research into what makes up Canada, where you might want to settle, and consider job opportunities there before and during your express entry process. And I should mention, along with emailing me after today, if you'd like copies of the slides, I'm happy to share those too. I won't go through in detail this slide either. Again, this was designed really for people who might not know very much about Canada, but these are some useful statistics and information points that, again, you'll have at your disposal if you'd like a copy of the slides. Importantly, let's talk about what immigration to Canada is. It seems like an obvious question and an answer. Obviously, it means coming to Canada or moving to another country or going to another country in some fashion. But it's an important question to ask yourself, because you'll be surprised how often I get asked in inquiries, I want to come to Canada, how can I do it? Can you get me a work permit? Can you find me a job? And those are good questions, and they're certainly interrelated. But I find that usually what people mean when they ask me that is, I want to move to Canada from where I currently live, and how can I do that? Do I need to first get a work permit? And that's also a good question. Often the answer can be yes, and you'll see as we go through those 3 permanent residence categories why a job or work experience might be important, but it's not the only consideration, and it's not necessary. So what is immigration? It means both temporary coming to another country, and it also means permanent. So temporary immigration includes things like visitor visas, study permits, work permits, and permanent residence contemplates permanent relocation, usually with a view to ultimately obtaining citizenship. It's not necessary, but that tends to be what our clients are looking for when they ask us about permanent residence. Immigration in Canada, as I noted, is governed at the federal level, and in particular by the branch called Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC. You'll see that acronym everywhere anytime you're filing an application or going online to do something. And IRCC basically regulates, governs, processes all applications relating to immigration, and makes the ultimate decision on your immigration application. Some useful highlights or qualities that I would describe Canada's immigration system with. It's diverse, usually or often referred to as a celebration of multiculturalism. That's something with full disclosure, I've borrowed the phrase from the IRCC website, but I think it's a great descriptor of what our system is. It is a celebration of multiculturalism. We're a leader in managed migration, and what that means is, across the world, we've got programs that are rich, diverse, and ever-changing in a way that I think really puts us at the top of most countries, and in particular, Western countries with their varied immigration system. I think Canada is known to be a leader in that, and particularly with the express entry system, which from my understanding, has been sort of a template for other countries designing similar types of systems. It's very much driven by economics. What that means is, of course, there are a lot of programs that are not based in that. I mean, you've got sponsorships of family members and refugee law, which is not necessarily economics driven. But you'll see that the wide majority of programs and categories do have an economic underpinning. And the question in those is, what does the person seeking to come in have to offer Canada from an economic or societal perspective? And then lastly, and perhaps the most important factor, is that it's a fair system. It's based on non-discriminatory principles. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the country you're from or your race, religion, ethnicity, things like that. Of course, where you're from may ultimately impact certain things, such as your ability to access certain education or job opportunities, and in turn, those may impact your application at some level. But I think by and large, our system is meant to not pay regard to those things, and I think it does a pretty good job of being that way. Looking at some useful statistics, the IRCC produces an annual report every year. The latest statistics that I found for 2018 are pretty promising and can show you, as you can see, a very thriving immigration system. This graphic and the information in it were adapted and borrowed from the IRCC website, so it may be familiar to some of you. But you can see in 2018, we issued over 6 million visitor travel documents. We admitted 321,000 permanent residents, 340,000 work permits were granted, and millions of visitor visa documents. In 2018, of the 321,000 PRs that we admitted, 186,000 of those were economic classes. And that's, again, something important for you to think about, because it shows you that it's the economics of it that really drives our PR process. Of that number, 92,000 were from the express entry process. So what is permanent residence, and how is it sort of looked at in the Canadian immigration system? I've broken it down into 3 silos: economic classes, the family class, and other classes. Other classes involve things like refugee law and permanent residence applications that are made based on humanitarian principles. These categories have their underpinning in humanitarian principles, and of course, as I pointed out before, are not necessarily done with economics in mind. The family class, as you'd imagine, deals with sponsoring family members. So Canadians or PRs can sponsor parents, grandparents, adopted children, and spouses. And when you look at the silo for economic classes, you'll see that there are many more than the other classes, and I can't even claim to have captured everything there. I think I have, at least in terms of general headings. But you'll see here I've defined it as these economic classes are made up of categories of people that have an ability to become economically established in Canada. And you'll see that throughout the minimum requirements and the point system process that applies to the express entry, how much it's rooted in the person's ability to become economically established in Canada. The programs that I have not highlighted might be of interest to some of you. I have a lot of people, for example, contact us about the Atlantic Immigration Pilot, for example. And if any of those other categories are of interest to you, again, I would ask you to please contact me after if you have questions about those. The ones that I've highlighted here are the 3 that are eligible for processing under the express entry system. And I say eligible, but really they're required to be processed under that system. And I'll talk in a minute about what express entry is and why we have it. But those 3 categories tend to be among the most popular categories. We get the most number of people coming in on an economic basis through those categories, and it will tend to be because the vast majority of people seeking to come find that those are the categories that they can meet. I mean, some of the other ones are very specific, like the caregiver category or self-employed. And so we'll go through each of those to sort of look through what the minimum requirements are to be able for you to be in a position to consider making an application under one of those categories. Before getting into them, just useful to highlight that in those annual reports that the IRCC comes up with, they've recently been including 3-year commitments to immigration growth and economy. It applies to all of those silos, but I've highlighted at the top the plans and commitments for economic classes. And overall, you can see that between 2020 and 2022, there is a projected commitment to bringing in 20,000 more people. And that's, again, something that you might want to bear in mind as you go through your own process, because it can often seem like you're missing some of the requirements or lacking something that's going to make you a competitive candidate. But I think knowing that there's a commitment to an increase might give us some hope that some of those requirements or setbacks that you might feel you have in your own application might not matter as much if we're admitting more people. So express entry, as I've said, applies to those 3 categories: the federal skilled worker category, the federal skilled trades worker category, and the Canadian experience class. And all it means is that these 3 categories of permanent residence applications and applicants apply under the express entry system. So prior to January 2015, it was a paper-based first-come, first-served system. Anyone who felt they met the minimum requirements under one of those 3 categories would submit a paper application by mail, and it was really first come, first served. So however many people applied within a certain period of time, and however many the government chose to accept in that time, those people would get their applications processed. And it was usually a very long process. January 2015 was an overhaul to the system. It went completely online, and it requires that any applications under these 3 categories be processed through that online system. And the way that it works, it's a 2-step process, and I'll highlight that throughout the presentation. But the first step is, do I fit into one of the categories? If I do, if I've made that assessment, I go online and I create what is known as an express entry profile. And I input all my information, my work history, my age, job offers from Canada, education, and it will tell me if I meet the minimum requirements for a particular category. You submit that profile online, and it's known as an expression of interest. Once you've been admitted to the express entry pool, which is what happens once you submit that expression of interest and you are found to meet minimum criteria of one of the 3 categories, that profile is valid in the express entry pool for 1 year. And what happens in that 1 year really depends on all the other people sitting in the pool. So you might get in under one category, but you're now in a pool of other people from all 3 categories who have also met minimum requirements. And in that year, you have an opportunity to be drawn by the IRCC as one of the top ranking. So that first process, step 1, is, do I have minimum what it takes to get in? And the next step is based on something called the comprehensive ranking system, where you're ranked by a second point system among all the others in the pool. If you are ranked high enough and you get drawn, that is selected by the government in a particular round as being one of the highest ranking, you'll be offered an invitation to apply for permanent residence. And that is also all done online. So we're going to go through that in a bit more detail. But first, I just want to highlight some key terms that you'll have no doubt come across in your own research. I'll try to go through them quickly, even though they're each one of these, again, could take a half an hour to just describe each of them. The Canadian language benchmark is an important factor here. You'll note throughout all 3 categories that you have to demonstrate by an official measure of your English language proficiency where you score. This applies to French too. You can do one or the other, but I'm focusing on English here because my presentation is in English. But there are a number of tests you can take that are approved by the Canadian government as a test that will measure your English language proficiency. And you're measured across 4 domains, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. You'll probably have heard of IELTS, which is an international English language test, and you've probably heard of CELPIP, which is the Canadian English language test. And there's no real difference in terms of which one is better for the express entry, but international tends to deal with European accents, and the CELPIP test tends to deal with a Canadian accent. So depending on what you're more used to, one or the other might be better. Skilled work is an important concept in all of this. All 3 categories contemplate that the person has skilled work experience. You need to have a certain level of it, and it needs to be determined to be skilled. We determine whether something is skilled by reference to Canada's National Occupational Classification System, or NOC code system. All the jobs in the world that you can think of are listed in this online database called the NOC system, and each potential job has a code, and they're set up by categories. So NOC 0, that is jobs that start with a 0 in the number, and it's NOC code, are management type jobs. Those are deemed to be skilled work. NOC A jobs tend to be professional jobs requiring some university education, so obvious ones are doctor, lawyer, accountant. Those are NOC A jobs. And the NOC B jobs tend to be technical ones, usually requiring college or some sort of on-the-job training. And all of these are listed in the NOC database with their code and duties and usual education and training required. There are also NOC C and NOC D jobs, often can refer to more menial tasks. Those won't qualify as skilled work in any of these 3 categories. Stemming from the concept of skill work is the idea of full-time work. You'll see again throughout the categories that among the minimum requirements are demonstrating a history of full-time work. And we define full-time work by reference to 30 hours a week if done over a 52-week period. So that would mean 1,560 hours. And you'll see why that's relevant when we get to the categories. Education credential assessment refers to an official designated body preparing an assessment of one's international education. So if you've got a degree from another country, you would submit it to one of these designated organizations. WES is one that we commonly use, World Education Services. And they'll evaluate where your international education ranks in terms of a Canadian education credential. So it's not uncommon to see, for example, something that's considered a bachelor in another country to be considered a 2-year diploma in Canada. And it's also not uncommon to have them equate properly. So you've got to get it done in most cases, and doing it early is good. And then lastly, we've touched on the comprehensive ranking system, or the CRS system. This is the points-based system that comes into play in step 2 of the express entry system. If you ask me for a copy of the slides, this will just help you try to evaluate where your IELTS may put you. I've highlighted CLB level 7 because that tends to be a common requirement among the 3 categories, and this just tells you under the IELTS test how you would get a CLB 7. I point that out only because it's different with the CELPIP. Under the CELPIP test, a 7 in reading, writing, listening, and speaking is a 7 CLB, whereas you can see here with the IELTS, a 6 in each of those categories actually equates to a Canadian language benchmark of 7. So now the 3 categories. I'll start first with the federal skilled worker, and then I'm going to talk about Canadian experience. I will touch on federal trades, but in all honesty, I'm not going to go into very much detail about it today. Like a lot of things I've pointed out today, that could take a whole seminar unto itself. It's very specific. So I will highlight the minimum requirements on it, but would ask you to contact us if you've got further questions about it. The federal skilled worker category is one that will tend to apply to those of you who are not in Canada or who have not gained Canadian experience. It's a category meant to attract people from other countries that have gained valuable skilled work experience over a long period of time, and who have, good English skills and the sort of demonstrated economic ability to establish themselves here. Among those minimum requirements, the first four, just to establish minimum eligibility for this category and to submit an express entry profile, you've got to be able to show that you have 1 year of full-time and continuous paid skilled work experience in the last 10 years. So what that will mean is you've worked for at least 1,560 hours within the last 10 years, and it has to have been gained over a continuous period. So it can't just be some hours in year 1, a few more in year 4, and then the rest in year 10. It has to be continuous, and it has to be paid. You've got to be able to provide an education credential assessment. While there's no requirement as to the level of education you've had, you have to provide the assessment. You must show a minimum CLB of 7, and you've got to have a certain amount of funds. I think it's 12,000 something for an individual applicant, and it's more if you're bringing family members. In terms of the fifth requirement, I have it highlighted, and I'm talking about it separately because it's a bit of a tricky one. That fifth requirement asks that you score 67 out of 100 on 6 factors, which I'll show you in the next slide. But I say it's tricky because, for example, the first requirement is that you have 1 full year of work experience. But you'll see in the 6 selection factors, to get at least 67 points, you can add more years of work experience, and you can add more education and higher language ability to increase your points under the 5th category, or the 5th requirement. So in a summary format, I've just shown what those 6 factors are: language, age, education, work, having a job offer. And you can see that you get maximum amounts of points stacking up to 100 under each of those factors, and you get those points by a range of things. So, for example, if you're between the ages of 18 and 37, you'll get those maximum 12 points for age. If you're over 47 or under 18, you'll get 0 points. And if you're between 38 and 46, you'll get points ranging from 1 to 11. And it works that same way for all of the factors. So the more education you have, the more you can get more points, up to a maximum of 25. Adaptability, if you've got a spouse that has high English language ability, that will give you points up to a maximum of 10. Having a Canadian relative will give you points up to that maximum of 10. And then having a job offer that meets a certain set of criteria might also give you points. This next slide just shows you kind of the really detailed layout of how you get to that if you want to make that assessment yourself about where you stand. But ultimately, you need to be able to show that you've got the 67 minimum out of 100 on that 5th minimum criteria, in addition to the other 4. And remember, I think it bears mentioning again here that all of this is just to show that you meet the minimum to even be submitting a profile and being put into the express entry pool. This does not yet mean you are making an application for permanent residence. It just gets you into the pool to be considered. So just useful to look at some case studies. I've got Adam here who has a bachelor's degree, which was equated to a 4-year Canadian degree, so that's good. He scored a minimum CLB 8 on his IELTS. He's worked for 1 year as a communications specialist at a European company. That should be a NOC A job. He's 25. He's married, and his wife has received a good English score that's going to get her points on the selection factors. And he has an aunt living in Canada as a permanent resident. So I've added up his points on the side, and you see he gets a 72. So that's good. We can assume he will have the 12,000 or so in minimum funds, and we know that he meets the other minimum criteria. He's got at least 1 year in the last 10 years. He's got an ECA done, and he has a CLB that's even higher than what he requires. he gets points for his aunt, and he gets points for his spouse's language ability. So were he to submit a profile, he'd be admitted to the express entry pool. Shalini, you can see, is even better. She's got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, both evaluated as equivalent to Canadian versions of those. She's a CLB 10, so really high English language. She's been working for 4 years in a NOC A job. She's 30. She's married, and her husband has a CLB 7. So looking at the right side there, you can see her points stack up to 77. And were she to submit a profile, she would be admitted to the express entry pool. Then we have James. James has great education, a 3-year bachelor's degree. It's been equated to a Canadian one. He meets the CLB 8, so he's above what he needs. He's got tons of work experience. He's been working as a sales manager for 15 years. He's 40, and he's not married. He has no Canadian relatives. Unfortunately for James, his age is a huge factor here. He's lost 5 points that he could have gotten were he between the ages of 18 and 37. And I think in his case, that's one of the biggest ones. He's also where he could have had a maximum, I believe, of 28 points. He's at 20 for his IELTS. So poor James, if he were to submit a profile, it wouldn't get him into the express entry pool. So what could he do? How could he improve his score? My assessment is that the easiest way for him, the quickest way, would be to take a crash course, bump up his CLB. If he can get himself to a CLB 9, he'll actually gain 4 more points and be up to a 67. Since he meets all the other minimum requirements of job, years of experience, and providing a CLB score, and also having the minimum funds available, he would likely be admitted to the express entry pool. I've just highlighted that if you wanted to also try getting points through more education or work experience, that would be even better in terms of what that would do for him down the road. You'll see with his CRS points in the step 2, but that's a longer route, more challenging. So again, just to summarize then, we're looking now here at the Canadian Experience class. And the Canadian Experience class is really a little bit less intimidating when you look at the minimum requirements. And in a sense, this has built into it the assumption that those who have Canadian experience have already demonstrated at some level an economic viability in Canada. Now, that doesn't say that anywhere in the legislation, but my interpretation of why the Canadian Experience class is a little less stringent is that there's an assumption that those who have studied here and may have then gained their work experience here through those studies have already a demonstrated level of economic viability. So minimum requirements to be considered with a Canadian Experience class profile is 1 year of paid full-time skilled work experience in Canada in the last 3 years. So unlike with the FSW category, it's not the last 10 years, it has to have been in the last 3 years. And one thing you don't have to do that you had to do with the FSW is show that it's continuous. So it could have been gained over, breaks in time, over the last 3 years. But again, minimum 1,560 hours must be shown in that 3-year period before you submit your profile. And you need a CLB 7 for NOC A jobs, a CLB 5 for NOC B jobs. Just by way of example, I've got Jessica, who did her bachelor's in Ontario, very high CLB 10. She's 27 years old. She worked throughout her undergrad. She obtained a 3-year work permit after graduating, but then she returned to her home country for 2 years. She graduated and went home, and she wasn't working. She was just traveling and catching up with friends and family, and not thinking yet, wanting a break before deciding on next steps. And then she returned to Canada 5 months ago. For the first 3 months, she's been working at a coffee shop because she couldn't find work in her field. And then for the last 2 months, she's been finally working in a NOC A job. She's only got 7 months left on her work permit. So if you add that up, Jessica's only going to be able to get 9 months of skilled work experience at best before her work permit expires. And once her work permit expires, she's not going to be able to continue working unless she gets another work permit. So in Jessica's case, were she to submit a profile now, or even in 7 months from now, she wouldn't meet those minimum requirements. One thing she could do, and which she might have an advantage in doing, is trying to get another work permit that will extend her time working for the current employer and keep working until she gets at least that 1 year. If and when she does, she'll still be young, she'll still be under 30, and if she were to submit a profile then, she would most likely be admitted to the express entry pool. Federal trades, just because I think I'm running out of time, I won't go through it. You can see it's got a number of requirements specific to trades. They involve having a certificate of qualification or a job offer, and then skilled experience in a number of different trades. But I'm going to skip over that, so please do email us if you have questions about the trades category. So in summary, you determine your eligibility, you create an online profile, and if you meet the minimum requirements that you assessed yourself to meet, you will be admitted to the express entry pool of candidates. Remember that profile that you submitted once you're into the pool is valid for 1 year. So thinking now about that second step, the second step is, how do I now get an invitation to apply for permanent residence? I've been admitted, I showed that I met the minimum requirements, now what? That's where the comprehensive ranking system comes in, or the CRS points. It's a points-based system that assesses you according to your CRS factors once you're admitted to the pool. It ranks you among other people based on things like your skills, your language, your education, work experience, and things like that. One of my slides shows you a more detailed account of the 4 general subheadings of the factors under the CRS and how it is that points are scored. But even my slide is a little bit convoluted, and it's a convoluted version of a more convoluted system, which you can find online if you look up the regulations and on the IRCC website in terms of how the point system works. It's very detailed. It can be quite hard to figure out when you're just reading it. I say all that just to point you to this link at the bottom of my slide, because that slide takes all of that complication away. This is an online tool provided by the IRCC where you just put in all your stats and details, and it will tell you what your points are, and it will break them down by categories. So once you're into the pools, you're now ranked among other people, and the point system, I'm just going to skip ahead to my next slide. The point system is one that can rank you out of a total possible 1,200. So this is the slide I was referring to when I said it's a summary of what's already a very convoluted points calculation system. But you can see here 4 large subcategories: core human capital factors like your age and education, transferability of skills, so that's really decided by a combination of different factors, so how your education combined with your language ability ranks, and other things like that. There's a category for your spouse, if you have a spouse. You can see the circles I have in blue, that where you can gain points for your spouse having really good qualities, you end up losing them on your own side. So this ends up being a consideration to make in terms of whether you actually want to include your spouse in your application or not. You would only do so if they were overall going to give you a bigger score, and you'll see that in one of my examples how it can differ. And then the 4th category is additional. So remember, under the 6 selection factors for federal skilled workers, having an aunt in Canada was relevant. It's now not relevant. The only thing that's going to give you points under the CRS is having a brother or sister in Canada. And then there's a number of other additional things, such as having a second language, having been to school in Canada, having a job offer. So going back to this slide, how does the point system work? How do the draws work? So once you're in the pool, it's anyone's guess. There's no official sort of regulation or mandate on how the government, how periodically, how frequently, and how many the government will draw from the pool. Recent history shows us, or history going back since the inception of this program shows us that draws are generally done every 2 weeks. And for the last year or so, the minimum score has tended to be hovering around 470 points. So 470 out of 1,200. And a lot of clients of ours have been maybe waiting around, hovering under that, waiting to see if maybe the scores will come down lower than that. Just before COVID happened, I think there was some hope. I think one of the latest draws before COVID and restrictions started coming into play, there was seeming to be a trend downward, and that combined with the government's commitment to increasing PR levels over the next 3 years was tending to give us some positive hope that that score might come down a bit lower. That's been halted a little bit because of COVID. What we've noticed in the last few rounds is that they haven't even been drawing from the federal skilled worker pool. The most recent draw on May 1st was for Canadian experience class only. This is good news for those of you who qualify under that, because in fact the score went pretty low. Historically speaking, it was 452 on May 1st. So, if we're looking at the possibility that the government will resume its commitment to increasing PR admissions over the next 3 years, once the COVID restrictions are over and we see all categories being drawn again in the next rounds, there's a chance that that score could go lower. But again, I would caution against that, and I would assume for the time being that you kind of need to be around that 470 mark to be considered to be given an invitation to apply. So let's go back to our people that we were looking at before. James, who had a tough time initially with his 6 selection factors because of his age, managed to bump himself up to a CLB 9, and so he made it into the pool. But with his 3-year degree, his 15 years of work experience, having no Canadian relatives, and being 40, you can see that he's only getting 369 points. Now, even though he's in the pool and we encourage him to submit a profile, because you just never know, it's unlikely he's going to get an invitation to apply anytime soon. You can see his biggest hindrance is his age. He gets 50 points for his age out of a maximum possible 110. So he's lost a lot of points there. Shalini, who was kind of our star under the 6 selection factors for federal skilled worker, is at 476. And you can see that's a combination of having very high points for age, 105, very high points for education at 135, having that great English language score, getting her 136 points. So she gets 376 just for the core factors. And then you add in her really great work experience combined with her really great English language scores. And under the skills transferability, she does very well. I haven't put the math there, but I've highlighted in the last bullet that if she includes her husband, who is 30 and only has a CLB 7 and worked in an OCB job, she loses points and goes down to a 452. And I apologize for not putting the math up to show why that's the case, but this is a reminder that you only want to include your spouse in situations where you're lacking points yourself and spouse is going to bring you up. In Shalini's case, she's already got all the points she needs herself, including the spouse is actually going to be detrimental to her. And as an FSW category applicant, she won't likely get an invitation to apply. In Shalini's case, she should probably do this on her own and then sponsor the husband later. And then Adam, who was our young guy with the bachelor's, he had 1 year of work experience, 25. He has an aunt who's a PR. You can see that he's even lower than James in his CRS points. And why is that? If you look down to the skills transferability, that's where he seems to lose the majority of his points. Why is that? Shalini has everything. She's young enough to maximize the age points on the CRS. She's mature enough to have gathered meaningful work experience. James has a strong profile, but his score is lower because of his age. probably James would need to get Canadian work experience to enhance his score. And then Adam, who's the lowest, he's got a lot of great things, but he's young and he hasn't worked long enough to get very much in terms of points for work experience. So what could Adam do? He could consider working for longer and then reapplying. He'll still be young enough by the time he does it. He's also young enough to maybe consider coming to Canada and getting a Canadian education. That'll give him points for Canadian education and also likely get him a work permit when he's done. That'll give him even more points. And then James, as I said, could consider work opportunities. Probably a little bit more difficult for someone like him who's been working for so long in a particular field, but it's an option and it's probably his only option. Looking at Jessica, who was our Canadian experience class lady, she's getting 474, and that's after she manages to get another work permit and keep working and get her 1 year. So I've included her 1 year of work experience here. But it's very interesting to compare her to Shalini, who this lady has only had 1 year of work experience, and she has no Canadian relatives, but her Canadian education and her Canadian work experience are worth a lot of points. And so even though she seems to have less going for her than Shalini on paper, they end up coming out at about the same points, largely because of Jessica's leg up from having Canadian experience. So that's not to discourage those of you who are not Canadian experienced people. If you're still from abroad and you've got work experience, I think it's really important to do this analysis and see where you fit in. If you're someone like Shalini, it won't matter a whole lot if you're still getting those great points for English language ability and age. So just in summary then, what is that process? It means thinking about what are your skills and attributes, how do they fit into the minimum requirements under the 3 categories, and if you think you meet the minimum requirements for at least one, submitting an express entry profile online, entering the pool of other eligible candidates, getting your CRS score assigned, done automatically based on your profile, and then being ranked among others in the pool. And you don't just sit and wait to see whether you get invited. If your status changes throughout the year that your profile is valid, you should update your profile, make sure that if you've got new education or you got a better English score, you update it, because that could always increase your chances. And then you wait for that invitation to apply. And as I said, it seems to happen every couple of weeks for the highest ranking applicants or candidates. The ultimate end goal is to be able to apply for permanent residence, and I'm not really touching on what the application process itself looks like. If you've met those minimum requirements, you've gotten through steps 1 and 2, the application process will involve now proving everything that you said was the case in steps 1 and 2. So if you said that you had 15 years of work experience under NOC A, under a particular NOC code, you're going to have to now be able to prove that. And that's a whole other seminar into itself. What do you need in order to actually apply? So always think about that from the beginning steps, from the point in time where you're creating your profile. Think about what you're going to be able to get together to prove it later on. Because if you can't prove that you have the work experience that you said you had, that can be fatal to your actual PR application. So pay stubs, letters from your employer, tax returns, things like that. And in particular, documents that show hours worked, because remember, you have to demonstrate full time, and it has to be over a certain period of time, depending on the category. So start thinking about those things. Think about your education credential assessments, your IELTS scores. English language scores have to be recent within the last 2 years. So those are things to think about. Happy to chat with you further if you want to get in touch with us, because I know I haven't really done a review or summary slide about those things. But those are very important things to think about from the beginning stages. So just in overview, the express entry system began in January 2015. It's among the most popular, or probably is the most popular way that people immigrate to Canada. We saw out of the 300,000 PRs that came in 2018, 92,000 were express entry, 186,000 were generally economic categories. And this express entry system is meant to be easy. It's meant to be completely online. People are supposed to be able to do this themselves. We have a lot of clients that on whose behalf we do it, but the system is meant to be one that applicants can engage in on their own. Generally, I think in our case, in our office, we're finding applications tend to take about a year. When the system first was introduced, it was supposed to reduce it even less than that, but things happen throughout the processing of an application. Sometimes you'll get questions from the officer reviewing your case, asking for more documents, and that's harkens back to my comments about making sure you have everything up front. Sometimes we've submitted what the client gives us in terms of proof of hours worked, and then the officer comes back saying, well, I noticed something here. Can you get me something more to really demonstrate that you worked those hours? So it's tending to take about a year. It's completely electronic, and it's something you can access at any time online in your own profile to see where you stand, both from the profile stage through to the invitation to apply through to the ultimate application. We've touched on some of these things, how you can improve your CRS scores if you're under that 470 mark. And just to reiterate, you can study more, you can work in your own country, you can try to work in Canada. You can compare based on whether you're including your spouse, not including your spouse, if your CRS points are better or worse. You can take more courses in your own country. You can study your English and try to improve. So those are all things that I would suggest thinking about again from early stages, and it doesn't hurt to be thinking of them throughout the process as well, particularly if you are wondering how you can improve your score. Had a couple additional slides on things to consider if you're looking to study in Canada, and also options to consider when working in Canada, or how to work in Canada. I'm not going to go through them because I think I'm running out of time now, but these are things, again, I'd be happy to discuss with you in more detail if you'd like to get in touch with us. I'd like to leave you maybe with some takeaways. Again, remember, think about these things early on, gather information early on. If you're an older applicant but you really want this, I do encourage you to be creative, think about prospective employers in Canada. Think about places that might support you in getting a work permit in Canada, because those work permits and work experience will get you more points to counter the drawbacks you're facing with your age. Consider having your degree evaluated. One thing we haven't really touched on, because it's, again, something that requires its own sort of seminar, is provincial nominations. I touched on that at the beginning of this, talking about how each province has its own programs. Those are gold mine of points. You get 600 CRS points if you have a provincial nomination. They're not particularly easy to come by. They have their own requirements that you need to look into. There's many, many different programs under each of the provinces and territories. So there's a lot of options, but it requires some research. But if you can manage to land a provincial nomination, that'll give you a lot of points. And I think just thinking about all of these things from an early stage will put you in good stead when you're actually looking to submit your profile, and ultimately when you're looking to submit an application if you've been given an invitation to apply. So I'd just like to leave you again with my email address and phone number. I've put my own there, but certainly you can look up any of us in the immigration group on our website and contact us. If you lose this or misplace this, you can also just email the address that you used to register. Like I said, if I get questions that I think are of a general interest nature, I'm going to put that all together and send an email out to everyone who's registered. I'm happy to take questions by phone or email anytime. I wish you all the best, and thank you once again for joining us and being part of this Express Entry seminar. Thank you.